Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we are discussing the 2018 dramedy The Favorite, and then we'll end with a critique of One Lucky Author's Query. You can also support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio.
Okay, here come the spoilers. It is the early 1700s, and England is at war with the French. Queen Anne is middle-aged, temperamental, and chronically ill. Harley, a member of Parliament, is desperate to stop the war, but more prominent members insist it continue. Presumably they're profiting off of it. Sarah, who's Anne's childhood friend and her clever advisor, convinces the Queen to support the war because it's good for her and her husband, Sarah and her husband. So Sarah's cousin, Abigail, arrives at the Queen's estate. She seems kind and she's very desperate for a job. Sarah takes her as a maid, and Abigail at one point picks herbs to ease a painful gout attack that Queen Anne has. Sarah is impressed and takes Abigail on as her personal assistant. Abigail finds out by accident that Sarah and Anne are lovers. And then Harley asks Abigail to spy on Sarah and Anne and bring him anything he can use to help him curry favor with the Queen. At that point, Abigail refuses. Sarah becomes busy with matters of state and sends Abigail to accompany Anne. Abigail sees this as an opportunity to win Anne's favor and improve her own situation. They bond and become lovers. When Sarah learns of this, she fires Abigail, but Anne, being the Queen, overrides Sarah. The rivalry between Sarah and Abigail escalates. Abigail adds herbs to Sarah's tea to make her sick. Sarah goes out on this horseback ride and is found hurt and unconscious outside of a brothel. With Sarah gone, Harley manipulates Anne into letting Abigail marry her suitor and making her into a lady. When Sarah comes back to court, she's appalled to see that Abigail is now a lady, and she uses her old love letters to blackmail Anne into continuing the war and banishing Abigail. She feels guilty for what she's done and burns the letters, but Anne no longer trusts her and removes her from the castle. Now Abigail, who's no longer the kind, desperate girl she seemed in the beginning, spends her days partying at court and reluctantly taking care of Anne, whose health is getting worse at this point. Sarah writes to her to mend fences, but Abigail intercepts the letters and lies, saying that Sarah was stealing from Anne. Anne, who by this time has suffered a stroke and is partially paralyzed on one side, exiles Sarah and her husband and ends the war. Carly, what did you think about the movie?
I really liked it. It was really dark and gorgeous and witty. I know we talk about how beautifully shot a movie is a lot, but this one was really, really cool. There were a lot of fisheye lens shots and slow motion shots and dolly shots that were really impeccable. I'll stop film nerding out in a minute. But I just want to say another really cool thing I learned that they did is they used almost completely mostly natural lighting in this movie, and it was really cool. It added a layer of ambiance and authenticity for the time period and some really dramatically lit scenes. So I was super into it. Okay. Apart from the film nerd stuff, done with that part, let's talk about the story. I found it really interesting. It was a very cool and great take on power, which I didn't really know going into it that it would be about that, but it's all about who has the power in the situation, and that's constantly shifting. These three women are all unhappy and trying to use each other, and who has the power in any given moment changes.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just between the two favorites having control of Anne, who they, like, manipulate her and threaten her and control her when she's really at her weakest and, like, easily controlled due to her illness. But at the same time, she's the queen and she also has all the power. Like, she even has the power in her illness that they all have to tend to her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was lots of cool layers, and I found that really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
What did you think?
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out to me visually was that the three main leads, all being women, didn't really wear like a lot of eye makeup or anything. So
Mm-hmm.
like, I mean, obviously they were wearing stage makeup, but they didn't look like quote unquote made up.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me also really lended a lot of authenticity to it as well. And so I thought that was really cool. It was just a little thing that like the history nerd in me kind of loved.
Yeah.
I do have this kind of love-hate relationship with stories about actual historical figures, especially when it comes to royalty and aristocracy. I think mostly because it's all like a part of the whole indoctrination of capitalism and yada, yada, yada. I won't get too much into that either. But this movie is so tongue-in-cheek and really shows some interesting perspectives on that kind of story. It's certainly anything but romanticized, kind of along the lines of what you were saying. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting that you said that about your film nerdiness, because the acting is always the thing I think I'm most critical of. Maybe because I've kind of dabbled in that myself.
Let's talk about that. You've dabbled in acting.
Yeah.
Is this whole thing like an act for you? Is your real name Jenny?
I would tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah, okay. Continue.
Olivia Coleman, especially.
Amazing.
She won like a gazillion awards for her portrayal of Anne. She was incredible. She somehow made me feel sorry for Anne, while at the same time feeling really repulsed by her selfishness and sometimes downright immaturity.
Yep.
There were so many layers there about her chronic illness and how people perceived her. It was all so well done just across the board. And then Emma Stone was also really brilliant. I think the role itself was really unusual, especially for a woman. On one level, it almost feels like Breaking Bad or something, where we see this person who seems naive and even fairly helpless at the beginning. And then by the end, she's really corrupt and very unlikable. But really, there's so many little hints along the way that she was always like this and just didn't have a chance to fully realize that aspect of her personality. And yeah, so for that to be that character to be a woman in a movie that is primarily only women is really unusual.
Well, I feel like the shot that kind of encapsulates both what I said and you said
Yeah.
is the last shot of the movie, where it's just these close-ups of their two faces, and they last for so long,
Yeah.
and they don't say anything, but the acting
so uncomfortable.
the
And
acting's
it's so
phenomenal.
uncomfortable. And you can see how like neither of them is really happy here, but like
No.
there is that power dynamic at play. And yeah, I think the whole movie was just really brilliant and definitely not what I was expecting it to be.
No. Same.
So I was really glad that we watched it.
Me too.
Yeah. So what's something that this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
All right. Scene structure, very, very definitely. This story very blatantly uses chapters to mark different sections and scenes. So there are, I think, 8 chapters in total in this movie. And they're kind of a great way to break up the movie into sections that really define the story and give it that novel feeling, which I also think helps with historicals a little bit, because that tends to be the lens that we view things through.
Right.
But anyway, so I read that the screenplay didn't already include the chapters. It was a device added in during the editing process. And I think that really speaks to how natural scene structure is.
Yeah.
People do it by default. And like part of that is that we consume so much media, it kind of becomes ingrained in the way that we interpret and perceive stories. I think, Jenny, you and I have talked a ton about how a lot of the topics we cover, you're probably already doing them somewhat naturally.
Right.
And that doesn't mean it's not that you don't need to work on them or look at them with intention, but you'll often find that a lot of that's there already just because we consume so much media, it kind of comes out naturally. So in this movie, they're working from like a chapter structure like all novels. And chapters give readers a break, but they also help a story to feel like it's moving along.
Right.
So you don't want nonstop action or too fast of a pace because it's exhausting and draining. Chapters and scenes in general give your readers kind of a mental pause and force them to almost reset.
Yeah.
So while the story is continuing, they know that the scene has kind of stopped and that something new is about to begin. This structure kind of makes a story easier to interpret and prepare for on kind of a subconscious level. So I think the chapters in this movie are kind of really helpful because we know when we're getting into a new stage of the plot. And a lot of movies don't really present things that way, but like
Right.
this movie, the power shifts constantly and the characters change so drastically that like having this chapter structure wrapped around the scene structure is kind of really a helpful way to like get viewers on with the plot and like understand what's going on. Because each section is a little bit different. There's motivations, actions, intentions, etc. that are all a little bit different and they've all progressed. So now that isn't to say you should do that for each chapter of your book, because please don't. Books have way more than 8 chapters. Chapter doesn't mean scene, but in this format, it gives us a really good way of kind of looking at scene structure and how each section is kind of like a mini plot or story all of its own.
Yeah. All of that. We don't even need to keep talking about it. You just said all of it.
Perfect. Done.
So, yeah, I think scene structure is something that I think we kind of take for granted in writing. I think it is very much one of those things that we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to because it feels so natural. When you read a lot, like you just pick up that scene structure. And I think it can be really helpful to study these things, though, because when something comes naturally, you don't tend to think about a lot. And then when you have a problem, you're not sure where to go to fix it. So studying these kinds of structures can be really helpful when you do encounter an issue and you're not 100% sure what to do about it. And it can also, I think, give a story more intentional impact, which is something we're also always talking about. So yeah, so scene structure has a lot of powerful impact on an overall story because really each scene is like a mini version of, an overall story, which means what I mean is that each scene needs a beginning, middle, and end. It needs conflict and tension, both internal and external. All the elements that you think of when it comes to storytelling apply at a story level as well as that overall big picture, or at a scene level, I'm sorry, as well as that overall big picture story level. So plot, character development, setting, world building, goal, motivation, conflict, all of that is just as important in a scene as it is in the overall arc. And that's because at a fundamental level, scenes are really the building blocks of story structure. So when it comes to when your scenes aren't working, it means that the whole story is going to feel off, even if your plot and character arcs look really good on paper, so to speak. And yes, I think that in any movie, really, we can see scene structure, but it is something that feels a little bit more like natural and doesn't have those strict kind of boundaries that this movie does. So yeah, I think this is a great movie to use to talk about scene structure because it does have that unique structure. And the chapters create those like little vignettes and it makes it more obvious than a lot of movies do. So when we're talking about writing, we tend to use scene and chapter pretty interchangeably. But for the purposes of this episode, we're talking about a structural scene, which is not really the same thing as a chapter. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit more later. In terms of a structural scene, there's a really important concept we haven't really touched on much in this podcast, that is called scenes and sequels. And I'm just going to say now, like, my brain still really struggles with this terminology.
It's so confusing.
I know. It's always like, but aren't there already things called scenes and sequels? And
Yeah.
yes, there are.
You shouldn't be able to break down a scene into a scene and sequel.
You should not. And it is not right or
Bad
fair. And I don't
terminology.
like it. And I don't know who came up with this, but I don't like them.
Mm-mm.
So another way to think about scenes and sequels in terms of every structural scene is having that they have an active part and a reactive part. So the scene is sort of the active part, and then the sequel is the reactive part. And if you've ever seen one of those graphs that shows the overall plot arc where there's this sort of jagged line that shows the tension building to the climax, you can almost envision this like scenes and sequels / active part, reactive part as a similar kind of arc. And as we go through this, you'll also see that it builds on like goal, motivation, conflict too. So this one's like a deep cut, Carly. This is some like next level writer 200 kind of stuff.
You think they're ready for this? Like,
I don't know.
Well, here's hoping,
but I think we're going to throw them in.
They gotta swim. Here we go. All right. So for the most part, as Jenny was kind of saying, every scene has active parts, and usually there's 3 of them: goal, conflict, and disaster. So the main active section of a scene comes from these 3 elements. So let's start with goal. At the beginning of every scene, your character wants something. They have an emotional wound or motivation that is leading them to strive for a goal. It doesn't need to be a huge goal for every scene. It can be something really small. I mean, a terrible example, but like maybe they need coffee to wake up. That's their goal. They want some coffee. So it can be small, but it needs to be there. So in the beginning of this story, in this movie, Abigail's goal is to get a job and become indispensable to Sarah. She starts off by wanting Sarah to want her around because that gives her security and safety, and her father tore that away from her. So this is her goal in the beginning. Then we have conflict, which is the next piece, and that's usually the story acting upon the character. It is what gets in the way of your character achieving their goal. It can be internal or external, and usually it's a little bit of both. What must your character overcome or deal with in order to achieve their goal within the scene? So for Abigail, Sarah has no interest in her in the beginning. She wants Abigail to stay in her place, be a maid, not overstep, and just get things done. Sarah has absolutely no need for Abigail. So Abigail must find a way to become important to Sarah. And she does this by soothing Anne's inflammation and pain with that herbal ointment. Suddenly, Sarah can use her. She's helpful. And then we get to the disaster, or the consequences of the actions that your characters take. Every step your character takes needs to have consequences. And those consequences can be both good and bad, but preferably at least somewhat bad. And this is how you have active characters. They're responding to the world, and the world is responding to them. So kind of think of disaster as the world responding to your character's actions. So what have they done to overcome the conflict or handle the conflict? And how has the world then responded to that? So in this movie, Abigail becomes useful to Sarah, and therefore Sarah now needs her to keep Anne happy. But most disastrous of all, Sarah now trusts Abigail and begins to use her as a replacement, and she creates her own replacement by sending Abigail to spend time with Anne in her stead, which leads to all sorts of disasters in this movie. So all of those kind of action and then consequence.
Really, if you think about it, all of this is common sense in a lot of ways. This is what we all have to do in real life situations too. Like a bunch of stuff happens and then we have to figure out what to do next. And then the reactive part of a scene is where the character has to reassess and figure out what to do next. So the three reactive parts are the reaction, where the character reacts to the outcome, aka the last part Carly was just discussing is the outcome. The dilemma, where they have to think about how to overcome the consequences of the stuff that just happened and still be able to work toward that big story level goal. And then the decision, where the main character has to make a choice about what to do based on all the options that they figured out in the dilemma portion. So one of the things that makes this movie such a good one to use to talk about the scenes and sequels is that the plot is very overtly like one character takes an action, then the other character freaks out and figures out how to one up the other one. And so, like, as complex as all of the layers of the story are, the plot itself is actually fairly simplistic, which makes it easier to see how these elements kind of play out. So the reaction sequence that stood out most to me in the movie is when Abigail poisons Sarah. She thinks it's just going to make her a little bit sick, but in truth, it makes Sarah really ill. And because of the unforeseen circumstance of Sarah being pretty much held hostage by the owner of the brothel, there are these unintended consequences that Abigail has to deal with. She's legitimately concerned she might have killed Sarah, which might be traced back to her in a way she didn't expect the whole situation to happen. So in the freaking out, aka reaction portion, Abigail's very worried that even if she gets what she wants from the action she's taken, which she totally does, by the way, that she has all these other possibilities to think about. So she has to decide if she's going to have people look for Sarah or wait and see what happens, or just go ahead with her plan like nothing happened at all. And during all of this, she's also dealing with that emotional level of worry. So like a lot of anxiety and all of that. So finally, she decides to take advantage of Sarah's absence as planned, but she still has those concerns that there will be consequences, which of course there are. Because it would be pretty boring if the story was just like a person does something and they win the end.
Unintended consequences are the best.
They really are.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we put it all together? Now comes the cool part. And maybe it's not actually a cool part and I'm just a book nerd. But when you kind of put it all together, you create this really awesome cycle that creates a plot. And the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm realizing that it is weird that I think this is cool. But too bad. I am who I am. Anyway, so when you put together the scenes and sequels, you create this cycle of conflicts and consequences. And as your characters are presented with conflicts, they take action, which leads to consequences. And those consequences create the next conflict that your characters must take action against. And so the cycle continues on and on. And as all of these stack up, suddenly you've got a plot. And plot is all about writing action and reactions, and this breakdown kind of really shows that. So, now, after we've kind of gone through all that, I want to emphasize something. Scene structure is not as exact a science as plot structure. Plot structure can have that percentage breakdown that we've kind of talked about before, like your climax and hitting things at the 50% mark, etc., etc. And with a plot structure, kind of as long as you're hitting those plot points at the right point in your book, you've got a solid structure. Scene structure is a lot more intuitive and changeable than that. They won't all be the same length. They won't all have the same amount of action versus reaction. The scene and sequel do not need to be the same length. Sometimes the sequel can be just a couple of sentences. Sometimes the sequel can be much more drawn out. It's really going to vary scene by scene, and it will change based on what is right for each particular scene. Like, different conflicts warrant different consequences and different time spent on each. So while you need this kind of pattern and this give and take, there's no set like numbered structure. It's all about what is right for each scene individually, which I think can take a lot of practice.
It definitely can. So that kind of makes me think, like, how do you know if a scene is working? How can you fix it if it isn't? When I see scenes that aren't working, it's normally because they're missing one or more of these elements. I think the one that I see most often that keeps scenes from working is missing the conflict portion. Essentially, those are where a character has a goal and they take action, but they don't really have any obstacles in their way. Another common problem I see is when the dilemma and or decision portions aren't fleshed out enough, or when secondary characters are the ones who are doing most of the thinking and or decision making.
Mm-hmm.
This is where problems come in with characters not having agency. So basically, if you're struggling with a particular scene and you can't quite nail down where it's not working, look at these 6 elements from the active and reactive portions of scene structure. Can you identify each element in the scene? Is your main character the one who's taking the actions to move from one element to the next? You can definitely have the occasional scene where there's not much in the way of external conflict, but they need to be few and far between, and they have to be absolutely essential to the story.
Mm-hmm.
These will be rare and must be used for impact. So do not let me hear that you've been telling people that I said it's okay for you to not have conflict in your scenes. I will use my mom voice on you, and you will not like it.
It is very scary. I do not like her mom voice. I'm just warning all of you. Don't do it. You will regret it. Speaking of Jenny using her mom voice, so she mentioned this earlier, so now I'm required to explain it. Scenes and chapters aren't the same thing. Chapters break up your story into chunks that make it more easily consumable for readers, but scenes don't perfectly line up with chapters. You can have multiple scenes in one chapter or a scene that spans multiple chapters. They don't perfectly correlate. So sometimes you'll end a chapter at the end of a scene, or you can end it between the active part of the scene and the start of the next chapter. It starts with the reactive part, aka the sequel. So like Jenny said, it gets confusing when you break a scene down into scenes and sequels, but shush, we're stuck with it. And that's just the way it is. Anyway, sometimes you want to end a chapter right at the climax of a scene so that you hook readers into wanting to read the next chapter. I do recommend doing this, but please don't do it for every chapter. It can feel very exhausting for your book. You want to hook them, but not everything should be a cliffhanger. Next, another difference is chapters should be close in length to each other. Like, some variety is fine, but scenes can have lots of variety depending on what makes sense for the conflict they're coming up against. Chapters are more of like a physical device for keeping your readers hooked, while also giving them that mental break of the story is about to continue, but it isn't all go, go, go. While scenes are more of a mental device for keeping readers engaged and feeling like the story is moving forward and the characters are active. So while they can seem like the same thing, and sometimes they can be the same thing, they're not exactly the same. They just have so much crossover.
Yeah, I like that distinction a lot of being like a physical device versus like a storytelling device.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I say similar stuff sometimes about like where you break your paragraphs and all of those kinds of things can have a big impact on like a reader's connection to a story and the
flow,
emotional impact of what they're feeling. So yeah, I think I tend to think of chapters as being like creating these kind of intentional breaking points that impact that same emotional connection and all of that. But yeah, that's all like a very physical thing that has to do with formatting as opposed to storytelling per se.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so I'm stealing that and putting it in my toolbox.
That's fine. As long as you think I'm smart, you can steal from me. Just say I'm right, and I will love you forever. Okay, so this month our query is an adult contemporary fantasy. Jenny, what are your thoughts on the query?
So what strikes me the most about this query is that it's a little scattered. What I think a lot of writers struggling with query letters don't understand is that there's something of a pattern when it comes to strong queries. They often have a similar structure that focuses on the main character, the main conflict, and the stakes. So typically I advise that the first paragraph should focus on the main character's emotional wound and what makes them unique. And then tell us what they want more than anything and why. Then in the second paragraph, tell what causes them to get involved in the main conflict and how their life changes because of that. Then in the final paragraph, you want to show how you raise the stakes even higher to make the main character have to confront their own inner demons and choose between the thing they thought they wanted most and then the thing that will actually help them resolve the conflict. And, like spoiler alert, often that ends up sort of being the same thing and they just, didn't realize or whatever. But, oh my God, I just had a thought. So, like, maybe you could use the scenes and sequel structure for a query letter?
Oh, yeah. I
don't
like
know.
that.
I'm going to have to think about this.
Let's
more.
mull
I'll
on
have to
it.
do some more research. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you definitely don't have to follow this pattern I just laid out of like 1, 2, 3 paragraph to have a successful query, but using the structure can really help when you're learning. So Carly, what did you think about the query?
Yeah, I agree. This one needs a good amount of work. It has a really interesting hook that kind of pulled me in. I think they spent a lot of time on that, and I can see that. But the next paragraph kind of goes on to talk about a bunch of different elements, and it's kind of hard to connect to any one thing because there's too much going on. We've got family conflict, a love plot, a magic system, a coming of age story, hidden identities and quests and all of this stuff. And because we've got so many elements, we can't focus on the important story aspects that lead to the main conflict and stakes. So I can't tell how each element is tied together because they all feel disparate. Like, how do they all come together to form your plot and your conflict? What are the main characters' motivations for doing the thing? What is the thing? And what will happen if the character doesn't do the thing? Those are kind of the main elements you want to focus on to write a really, really compelling query. Yep, I said that right. And streamline the rest. And if you do, I think it'll be really successful. You kind of want to focus in on the interesting, unique elements of your story to kind of streamline and do what Jenny said of hitting that kind of structure of stakes and conflict.
Yeah, when we are done recording this, I'm going to need you to go back and just end it where you said, do what Jenny says.
Okay, I'll do one version like that, and then I'll do another version when you tell me I'm right about everything.
I think I might just need, like, just a snippet of you just saying, do what Jenny said.
I feel like I say that a lot.
I want that to be like my ringtone. Do what Jenny said.
Do what Jenny said. I can record that for you separately. That's fine.
Perfect.
I got you. Anyway, so I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Next month, we are watching the cult classic Willow, and we will also have another query or blurb critique. So if you want yours featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can see this month's query in its entirety and support the show at patreon.com/storychatradio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.